Now, I have to view it as an unintended consequence. At least that's the hopeful part of me, because I've talked to many biomedical researchers, people who are working on stem cells, and they do have a financial interest in making progress, in making breakthroughs, in discovering processes and potential medications to address conditions that they are investigating. And so I do see a positive side to that. But what you point out in the film, and once again, I think you're very careful in the way you presented this, you don't draw a conclusion, but you raise a very important question. There is a national panel on infectious diseases, and they published a report a few years ago. It was 2002?
2006.
2006, regarding Lyme disease, where the consensus, according to the published report, was that this panel of experts said there is no such thing as chronic Lyme disease, and therefore treatments for chronic Lyme disease are out of the mainstream, out of the protocols for the medical establishment. Tell us what you found out about the individuals who make up this infectious disease panel and their connections to patents on bacterium or other organisms related to Lyme.
Okay. Yeah, it's just funny because I'm a filmmaker, and when I look at what I'm talking about these days, it's really very far away from filmmaking. So it's just every time I start to talk about this, I do smile because this is very long way from where I thought I would be several years ago.
You didn't see yourself as an investigative reporter, a muckraking?
No, I didn't. As a matter of fact, a lot of my background is in visual anthropology. And really, I'm interested in stories about people. Mm-hmm. It was not so much muckraking. It is uncovering sort of the human story, the human condition, but not so much all this the muckraking and the medical issues. So to get back to this particular issue, we all act in our best interests, and we do that probably unconsciously. So I want to start out by saying that. So not that these people are necessarily evil or that they're doing something that they know is wrong, but it's partly human nature. Now, in order to correct that, I think what's important is to have certain checks and balances in place. And one of those things is the issue of conflicts of interest. So the people who are making recommendations can't have conflicts of interest, meaning that their recommendations shouldn't be influenced by the interests that they may hold. In this case, they are commercial interests. But that's what's happening. That's what we've seen, that the majority of the people on the guidelines writing committee for the Infectious Disease Society of America, and they are charged or were charged with writing guidelines about the definition and treatment for Lyme disease. And these guidelines are used, even though they're explicitly said that they're advisory, they're used by doctors across the country as a document to diagnose and treat, and they're used by insurance companies to deny treatment.
Indeed,
because the guidelines say chronic Lyme disease doesn't exist. There's no infection. There's no reason to continue treatment. So that's a big problem. And what happened was, it wasn't just our film. It wasn't just us who were doing the investigation into this, but simultaneously, the Attorney General of Connecticut launched an investigation into the members of the guideline writing panel of the Infectious Disease Society Lyme guidelines. And what he found was very similar to what we found, that there were substantial conflicts of interest, individuals on that committee or their universities who had patents on potential vaccines, test kits, and were consultants for insurance companies. So
And refresh my memory on the numbers. It was
Well,
4 out of 11, 5 out of 9?
No, we're talking about altogether 11 out of 14.
11 out of 14.
11 out of 14 individuals or their universities had substantial conflicts of interest.
Now, in Supreme Court terms, we would require recusal. Even the Roberts Court, which I don't have a lot of faith in, found that a judge in West Virginia, for example, should have recused himself from a mining case because his patron, who had bought him the Supreme Court seat, benefited financially from that decision. So don't doctors have the same basic requirement of recusal if they have a conflict of interest on a matter that they're studying?
I think all I can say is not to my knowledge.
Okay.
I mean, it appears that that's not the case. You know, this is not my profession, but certainly that is not the case here in terms of the Lyme treatment guidelines. It's not the case. These people have sort of been self-anointed as the kingpins of Lyme disease, of the so-called experts.
Now, you interviewed one dissenter on the panel who described how essentially he was just kind of squeezed out of the final process when the report was written, and he wanted to raise his issues, but they didn't invite him, I guess, to the last couple of meetings where they approved their report that said there is no such thing as chronic Lyme.
Right. Yeah, and that's the way it happened. He basically had to resign because he couldn't sign a document that he didn't believe in. Mm-hmm. And you know what's interesting here is these physicians, I call them the gatekeepers of Lyme disease. Will continually, if you had them on this show, they would speak quite convincingly, with a certain bedside manner in many cases, and tell you that they would certainly be open to the notion of chronic infection with Lyme disease, but there's no scientific evidence. And they will continue to repeat that. There's no scientific evidence. And we just believe them. They're not just physicians, but they're academics, and they're the top academics at the top institutions. Mm-hmm. So this has been alarming. And it's really made me question not just what the orthodoxy is around Lyme disease, but what we accept as truth in all the aspects of our lives.
Now, have you gotten any feedback from members of this Infectious Disease Society panel? Have any of them seen your film and acknowledged that just on the face of it, you profile one case after another of people who are misdiagnosed or improperly treated for many years? Then they find a doctor who will give them massive long-term doses of antibiotics, and the symptoms go away. Have they even acknowledged the anecdotal power of the case studies you present?
Yes. First of all, the IDSA, that's the Infectious Disease Society of America, their official response to the film is long on emotion and short on fact. And again, this is akin to no scientific evidence. And again, you repeat that enough. You repeat that enough times, and your audience just believes you, unless you do the research yourself. And that's what's threatening them, is that people are beginning to do research themselves because of the Internet. And they're called Internet activists. And they are a big threat to the patriarchal medical system. And most of them, by the way, are women who are doing this. They're the ones who are taking care of sick kids, or they, in some cases, are sick themselves. And they're trying to find answers. They're forming communities online, and they're taking their health into their own hands. And this is a big threat to our medical system. So I think that's what's going on here on one level. And again, this Lyme disease issue is a microcosm and a case study for other issues in medicine and other issues in our society. Now, what was your question? I'm not sure whether I answered it.
Well, I think it's just that whether or not they are responding by acknowledging that you have pointed out something that at minimum deserves further study.
Right.
And have they acknowledged that even if their motives are not such, that the impact of their denial of this is sinister, on the lives of those who are suffering through this.
Yeah. Well, what they would say is they have compassion for people who are suffering, and I'm sure they do in many cases, but that they can't call it Lyme disease if it's not Lyme disease, and that any improvement of health because of treatment for for chronic Lyme disease is anecdotal, is just that it's anecdotal, and anecdotes are not science. And they will talk about the placebo effect, or they will talk about the anti-inflammatory properties of antibiotics.
Mm-hmm.
But the fundamental issue is they don't believe that Lyme disease can become a chronic infection. And if it's not, then that's not our problem. Pass it off to the psychologist. Pass it off to the rheumatologist. Pass it off to pain management specialists.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what's happening.
Yeah.